Good morning from sunny Cowes. The shadow of long COVID. It's so nice to see Cowes so busy, but we've had to make an emergency change of Yacht Club to find a little bit of peace and quiet. So thanks for the Royal London there in the thick of it, and to carry on our little video here today. David Fickling in Bloomberg wrote some very interesting analysis on the position of airline industry and the probable step change required if it's ever to function properly again. In line with Michael O'Leary's thoughts, we can expect around 5 years of steadily rising fares. The problem for the airline industry isn't that it's profiteering from our misery. It's that we're still not prepared to pay for the service that we want. Much of the rich world is emerging from 2 years of pandemic more flush than it's ever been. Deposits held by consumers at US commercial banks are roughly $3.5 trillion above where they'd have been if they'd continued the pre-pandemic trend, a position that inflation's barely begun to eat away. For the airline industry, it's precisely the opposite. While travel volumes are returning to something like normal in most of the world, the vast debts clocked up during 2 years on life support have barely shifted. If you're looking for an explanation for the chaotic scenes of cancelled flights, lost baggage and passenger number caps this summer, it's worth considering the drastic cost cutting the industry will be undergoing for many years to come. Airlines would dearly love to tempt passengers back with the promise of a return to business as usual. The stubbornly persistent debts they're holding makes that almost impossible. Net borrowings by more than 100 airlines globally, for which Bloomberg has data, were running at a combined $377 billion US in their latest reports, more than a third higher than at the same time in 2019, and that was already a rough year for the aviation industry thanks to rising costs, trade tensions. Compared to 2018, debts have doubled. The airline industry's aggregate net debt has risen to levels normally associated with insolvent businesses. While traffic volumes are starting to recover, profits are not. Earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, EBITDA, over the past 12 months across the industry amounted to $25 billion, an improvement on the $46 billion EBITDA loss a year earlier, but barely more than a third of typical levels going into the pandemic. The relationship between those two figures is a decent benchmark for a company's ability to service its debts. Right now, it's a flashing red warning sign.
Danger, Will Robinson! Danger! No, Will Robinson! Danger!
Banks start to get worried when their corporate borrowers have debts amounting to more than 3 or 4 times their EBITDA. That number went to 4.7 this time 2 years ago, before heading off the charts last year when EBITDA turned negative. This year, it's worse than it was in 2020, at 14.7, an almost unimaginable level for any solvent company, let alone an entire industry. Of 113 companies for which Bloomberg has data, only 23 are able to meet their interest payments out of earnings before interest and tax. The price of jet fuel in Singapore is running at the highest levels at least a decade, and those numbers may well get worse before they get better. Jet fuel prices typically make up about 20 to 30% of costs for airlines, are about 50% above their 2019 levels. Although net debt levels are down marginally since peaking midway through last year, the cost of servicing those debts has ballooned as interest rates have climbed. On a very rough estimate taken from the yield on a 10-year US government bond, airlines' interest bills this year will be almost double what they were 12 months ago, despite an 8.4% reduction in borrowings. Investors have taken notice. The Bloomberg World Airlines Index, a share price tracker which staged a remarkable recovery through March 21, has been trending down ever since. It's currently at levels compared with the darkest months of the pandemic. The travel chaos is best understood as an outcome of airlines struggling to rein in the few costs they can control. Around half of the world's 500,000 baggage handlers were put out of work in the early months of the pandemic, and tight labour markets ever since have made it hard to tempt people back to such a low-wage, low-security job. That's been made far worse by the fact that we appear to be focusing our travel more than ever on peak periods when the pressure on ground services is already highest. Airlines can also save money if they cram the passengers from 3 flights due to fly a third empty into 2 planes. One reason schedules have been trimmed and departures cancelled. Passengers will always end up blaming their travel on misery on airlines. But all the problems being experienced right now are the result of an industry that's still fighting to survive after 2 years in limbo. The chaos at baggage carousels, security lines, won't improve until airports see their cash flows recover, which in turn depends on the carriers, who contribute the biggest chunk of their revenues, chipping away at their own debt piles. At a time when inflation is picking up everywhere, global passenger yields, the amount of money made for flying each passenger 1 kilometre, are still likely to end the year at roughly the same level as they were in 2019, around 7 cents. The problem for the airline industry isn't that it's profiteering from our misery, it's that we're still not prepared to pay for the service we want. Until airlines and airports work off COVID's debt overhang, that situation is unlikely to change.